everyone, and welcome to Farmside, the show where we go into the science and education behind farming. I'm Emily Stein, and today we're checking in with Jeff, Nevin, and Bob at the conclusion of their seasons to see how things went and where they're at. So sit back, relax, and let's go find out what they've been up to. So Jeff, how did harvest in the end of your season go?
It was a rough season. We did finish harvest without too many hiccups, and we see the same challenges that we've generally seen before with reduction in dry bean yield in the wheat bean relay.
Can you make any preliminary statements about your observations this year?
So some of the trends from this year, one of the challenges we've seen, I should say, this year is what we've mentioned before. Because of the hot summer that we had some challenges in using herbicide management for weeds. This would have been a really good year to be able to cultivate the dry bean crop. Obviously, if in the winter wheat dry bean relay, cultivation isn't an option. So without that tool, it became a bit more challenging this year, particularly, again, because of the hot summer, to manage weeds really well. And that clearly had an impact on dry bean yield, particularly in all the crops that had in the treatment plots that had the wheat relay treatment present. General trends that we've seen, even in years like last year that didn't have the same herbicide management struggles that we had this year, we saw a reduction in dry bean yields in the wheat bean relay. So we continue to look to the future to find ways to modify that treatment, modify that strategy for to improve bean yield. That said, we have seen a trend in improved seed quality in the wheat bean relay. And what I mean by that is in the dry beans, in the wheat bean relay treatment, we see a reduction of Western bean cutworm damage. So that adds clear value to that treatment. But again, we're still suffering from this yield drag in the particular arrangement that we have in our wheat bean relay.
What are your next steps going forward?
So right now with the project, we've got an ocean of samples that we're going through. We're making progress on going through this year's subsamples of dry beans, scoring both the pods and the beans for Western bean cutworm damage, again, to assess that important bean quality characteristic, as well as taking yields on those plots and subsamples and 100 seed weights to evaluate that. And then we still have quite a few samples, although they're sorted. We have a lot of insect samples from our various sampling techniques, from sticky cards to pitfall traps to sweep samples and vacuum samples. They're all sorted, but we're working on identifying the individual species and doing counts, again, to ultimately come back to say whether or not these different treatments varied in the number of pests or the number of beneficial insects that are present. So we anticipate being through those samples probably around toward the end of February, beginning of March, before we have all of those data from this field season fully sorted through and calculated and analyzed.
And Nevin, how is the end of your season progressing?
Well, the season's still ending. We've got most of our crops harvested. So our potatoes, dry beans, soybeans, sugar beets, sunflowers, alfalfa even, corn's still to go. But for dreadful beans, which we're talking about today, that was harvested about a month ago now, maybe a little less than that. And so we have to pull those crops off the ground, and then we usually let them dry for a couple days or until the moisture gets ready to thresh, and then we use a combine, but rather than actually combine in the field, we just kind of have it running on a cement pad, and we throw a bunch of beans in there at a time from each plot and use it more of a stationary thresher. But that's gone well. We just have our corn to do, and that's not too big of a rush because it's a crop that has a little bit of wiggle room for when you can harvest it.
Are you analyzing any data yet?
Yeah, we've got most of our data analyzed. Well, I should say the Royal We has most of the data analyzed. So a number of the projects that we have in dryable beans, I still need to go through there kind of with the fine-tooth comb we call statistics. But for the ones, the projects I've been talking about most this year has been graduate work from Joshua Miranda, and he needs to graduate this semester. So he's already got everything analyzed. So that's been good with several of those studies. So we have the results ready to go, and that's good to go.
Can you share some of those results with us?
They're not even preliminary. Yeah, we're starting to prepare them actually for publication right now. But they're looking good. Yeah, his dryable bean Palmer amaranth interference work, kind of as we expected. The more Palmer you have, the more the dry edible bean yield goes down. We found that dryable beans are more susceptible to Palmer interference than most other crops. So this sort of Palmer interference work is a pretty standard type of research that occurs, and it's happened in a number of different types of crops: corn, soybeans, cotton, sweet potatoes. You name it, it's been done already. It hasn't been done in dry beans, and dry beans appear to be more susceptible than other crops are to Palmer interference, and so that's been nice to have that in there. That kind of gives farmers sort of a metric for what they can expect if they aren't able to control Palmer amaranth, what their yield impacts can be. And just to kind of put that in perspective, I think we've seen 4 plants in about 1,000 square yards, which is kind of a weird way of describing that, but that's enough to cause a noticeable yield impact on your dryable bean production. So not a lot of Palmer to reduce dry bean yield. And those plants, each one at that low of density, each Palmer plant is going to be producing, if they're a female, so about half of those would be female. So you're looking at about 300,000 seeds per female at that level of density. So that work's been done. The other work that we have analyzed that Josh was working on is looking at using Outlook, which is currently the only chlorocetamide or group 15 herbicide labeled in dry beans for post-emergent application. He's been looking at using that in a sequential pre-post program where you apply it pre-emergent with Prowl usually, and then before the herbicide wears off, you try to put out a second application to extend that period of weed suppression from the soil active herbicide. And we've been looking at 2 different timings, sort of a really early application, and then one that's more in tune when growers will generally put out their post emergent herbicide. And 1 out of 3 years of the data, we needed to have that earlier application. But the other 2 years, the timing wasn't a factor. And what we found is having that Outlook put out as a post, and even the only post herbicide, or as a lay-by in this case, we are getting equivalent Palmer amaranth control as if we were to use the herbicide Reflex or Fomasafen, which is labeled in our area. It's great on Palmer. It's the best Palmer herbicide we have in dry beans, but because of rotation restrictions, most growers in our area cannot use it. So the use of Outlook seem to be equivalent, and that's good news. So that's going to be the best recommendation moving forward for growers, is if they're concerned about Palmer, is to use Outlook in their post-emergent herbicide take mix. The third study that Joshua finished up is, although Outlook is the only group 15 herbicide, the very long-chain fatty acid inhibiting herbicides labeled for post-emergent application in dryable beans. That may change in the future. So dual magnum is another one that Syngenta may be expanding the label on to allow applications. And another one that BASF is looking into is Zidua or peroxysulfone. And so in addition to looking at Outlook, we also screen both of those herbicides to see if they provided as good a control of Outlook or even better or worse. And then we threw in Warrant as well, which is probably not going to be labeled in dryable bean, but we wanted to see if it could be. And what we found is Zidua, Dual Magnum, all provided equivalent control of polymer amaranth as in a sequential pre-post system as Outlook, and that was as good as using a reflex post-emergence. The Warrant or Acetochlor was a bit worse, but that probably wouldn't be the best fit for the system anyways. And for both the Outlook and Dual Magnum, you could use those pre-emergent and post-emergent if the future label allows that in Dual, where you could have use the same herbicide for both applications, while the peroxysulfone or Zidua, that's likely going to be a post-only option. It's not going to have a pre-emergent label because we did see some injury when applied pre, but you could easily just throw that in after Outlook or Dual.
Bob, how has your season progressed?
Overall, I guess we haven't got the results back from the sugar beets. You know, the tonnage and pounds per sugar and all pounds of sugar per acre, that sort of thing yet. But overall, it was very hot and very dry, and so we had trouble kind of keeping them wet. I think the yields are still going to be very good. We haven't seen that yet, but at the same time, there just was not any or very much Cercospora. We did see it some in the plots. But based on our different methods of, like the alert system, the Spornato thing, we just didn't see any need to make any applications. We went ahead and did just so we could say we did something about it. But we never, in our plots, never did see the values that are required for making applications.
Did you hear much about Cercospora being an issue this season?
I did not. No, I mean, I didn't. Nobody contacted us about it, and I didn't hear through the grapevine. I'm sure it was there in some, localized spots, but it just was not as problematic this year as it often is, and I think that is just due to the heat. A lot of it is due to requirements for it is at night, say from midnight to 7, and I could tell you that it was still up in the 80s. In our house, at midnight, and so that is part of the reason why it just wasn't as problematic. Problem is that we weren't able to evaluate the different treatments that we were trying to use, and so that's kind of a wash this year in terms of that.
So do you plan on repeating this study again next year?
I will plan on it, but it also will depend on Western Sugar and their desire to do it. But I am going to propose to try to do something, at least something similar to this again, using the alert system and using that Spornato spore catching device. I want it to go well for the growers, but we still need to try to do a little bit better job maybe of producing disease in our plots so we can evaluate the treatments properly.
Well, folks, there you have it. With all 3 research projects wrapped up for the year, the researchers are on to their data crunching. We get to see some of the preliminary thoughts that they're having, but for the most part, it's wait and see until after all the data comes in. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more episodes. Find us on Twitter at @FarmSci-Ed and visit our website at farmsci-ed.com for transcripts and more information. Have a good one!